I'm here to talk today about Ansible. I was asked on Sunday if I would give a talk to the user group, just kind of discussing both a review of working with Ansible for people who are not familiar with it, and then trying to get into some of the guts for people who are. The understanding I have is that there is a decent amount of Ansible knowledge in the room already, and so this talk is really going to be divided into two parts. The first part is going to be going over some of the basics of what this thing is, and the second part is going to be talking about some of the extensibility points, what it is that you can do to make your playbooks more readable, what you can do to make them easier to maintain, all that kind of thing. So because my understanding is that there is a decent amount of Ansible knowledge in the room, the first half of this is really going to be pitched as a review. It's something that probably most people have seen before, but that way, if there are people who don't have any prerequisite knowledge, I'm not leaving people in the dust. Ansible has a list of things to do. It's called a playbook. Reusable pieces are called roles. Playbooks and roles are structured as YAML files. In particular, they are YAML files that have as their topmost element a list, a YAML list. That list is of tasks, and those tasks are executed in order. A role might look something like this. I'm hoping this shows up reasonably well on the screen. It is a YAML file that installs Nginx and does a certain amount of configuration on it. It's actually from a project that I wrote last year. It gives output that looks like this. Each one of these items is the running of a task. The yellow is an indicator that something was done, that a change was effected on the server. The green is an indicator that the server was already in the requested state. If I was to take the playbook that I showed you a moment ago and run it again, I would get all green, because this playbook is extremely idempotent. We'll be talking about that a little bit later.
I don't know if you need the mic. It's pretty loud. The speakers are way too high.
Am I loud enough without it? Yeah. Everyone hear me? Okay.
Sorry for that.
Nope, you're fine. I told the people that I probably wouldn't need a mic, but maybe they didn't believe me. In keeping about this, when I end up going and having to do pitches or explain to tech people what this is, which again, I'm of the understanding that this is something that's already generally known, the things that I usually go over are kind of the highlights of how Ansible differs from other orchestration tools. The biggest thing that I always talk about is that it's agentless. Most orchestration tools involve installing a thing usually called an agent, whether it's a chef client or something else. The puppet master or whatnot, on a machine, and then that machine goes and pulls a central server asking what it is that it should do. Ansible works the exact opposite way. First of all, there is no agent because the agent is usually SSH. That's actually configurable, but SSH is by far the most common. That means that there are no prerequisites for orchestrating the machine other than having SSH access to the box, preferably by public key. It's the exact opposite model of performing work. Instead of the client asking a centralized hub what it is that it should do, the machine running the playbook sends out a command to the machine doing work saying, cause this thing to be done. And the Ansible module makes that happen. There's several advantages to this. You don't have to install an agent. This is actually a really, really big deal. It is work to get an agent on a machine, and it cannot be orchestrated because the agent is a prerequisite to orchestration. If there is no agent, then that prerequisite doesn't exist. Most cloud services actually have tools now to just have your SSH key on the box as key to root. So you can orchestrate out of the box. It also gives you a different ability to interact with a server topology as a whole, rather than having a specific server only in its own little world, having to ask out what other things are doing. And of course, security. SSH will probably always be more secure than agents just because of the pure number of people that use it, that look at it, etc. There is a decent amount of language agnosticism in Ansible. Ansible is written in Python, but it uses YAML for playbooks, and most extensibility that's commonly done, in particular inventory plugins, can be written in any language. They are shell scripts that have to run and return back JSON. Ansible does not care whether those scripts are in Python or in Ruby or what else. Although if you're actually trying to get code accepted into Ansible itself, for obvious reasons, it's required to be in Python. Ansible modules have a very, very, very careful and very complete understanding of idempotency. A best practice is that you don't want your subsequent runs to show changes. There are obviously exceptions to that. A very trivial one is if your run actually needs to touch a log file or some such. Obviously, that would be a change. And most key difficult modules, such as the shell module, have tools in place to know whether it needs to perform a command, or if it's performing a command all the time, whether that command made any alterations, things like change when. And when in doubt, custom modules can always handle more complex idempotency situations. And I went over this a second ago, but because there is an orchestrator, that's really hard to say. Because there is an orchestrator-initiated model, Ansible doesn't have a restriction of needing to install an agent, and you can orchestrate from anywhere. You don't have to have a central server. You can have a distributed system where anything with the playbooks and with SSH access can run your stuff. There's no need for a second store for code. No situation where you get into where you have version control that isn't really version control, or the juggling of having your local machine having more up-to-date playbooks than the machine running it, because you can just run it from your machine. Okay, now I've gone over the review, so let's get into some meat. This talk, the rest of it, is going to be about extending and customizing some of the pieces of Ansible, making your setup work for your server topology and your needs. Ansible ships with many, many, many modules. It ships with a whole lot of plugins for, like inventory for things like EC2, for Rackspace. But at the end of the day, probably most people have something in their ecosystem that is unique to them, that you have written. And having that interact with Ansible in the appropriate ways is valuable. And the reason why it's valuable is because it is the way to maximize the don't repeat yourself principle. By having a plugin that talks to your ecosystem, you don't need to have to figure out a way to get from the data in your ecosystem to the data that Ansible is reading. And that is what we are going to talk about right now. In particular, I'm going to talk about 3 different ways. There are more available, but I'm only going to talk about 3 because of time and because I found out I was giving this talk on Sunday. There are 3 built-in hooks that are most often used by developers that aren't us. Those are inventory plugins, lookup plugins, and callbacks. We're going to go a little bit into each one of those. There are several others. There are variable plugins. You can write additional modules if you need to. Those are not what we are going to go into tonight. Variable plugins because you probably don't need them. I'll actually touch on that when I get to inventory plugins. And modules because that's not the scope of this talk. So let's talk about inventory plugins. I should have had a slide in front of this that says what they are. Inventory plugins are a customized way to tell Ansible what your server topology looks like. What are your web servers? What are your database servers? What are your whatever different roles your servers, your various machines may have? What is the full list of your barnyard, basically, because servers are cattle? And what is the role of each specific animal? We ship a bunch of these with Ansible. If you use EC2, Rackspace, DigitalOcean, any of those kinds of things, we ship a plugin that will get you the list of servers, and it will know about the various tags that you have within EC2, within Rackspace, whatever. So if you've gone through in your EC2 account and tagged all of your servers to designate what their roles are, those tags will be known as groups within Ansible, whether you use something like Ansible Tower, which is our GUI built on top of this thing that we sell, or whether you do your own work and have playbooks that are keyed to a particular scope in the playbook.yaml file. If you have a situation that goes beyond what our plugins provide, then inventory plugins might be for you. They are a way to go out to whatever various and sundry locations you have, find out what your server catalog situation looks like, and be aware of those things, whether it be by IP address or by host name or whatever else. Let's talk about a write one. So I just said its primary purpose is to describe at runtime the hosts and the groups that compose your server topology. And hosts and groups are vocabulary words. A host is a specific server designated by host name or by IP address. A group is a group of them. That is a many-to-many relationship. One host can be in more than one group. It can be done. I suppose same host could be in the same group twice, but that's pointless. Oops, sorry. Go back. Go back. Am I going back? Yes, good. This is a very simple shell script. It's going to take options that we're going to discuss. If you read my advanced slides quick enough, you now know what they are. And it spits out JSON. All it has to do is spit out valid JSON to the shell. So it's talking about writing these things. Inventory plugins must be schmotted executable. Or if you're using Ansible in Windows, which is available as of 1.7, then it must be however you make something executable in Windows. It must take two options. It must take a Boolean option called --list, and an option called --host, which would then accept a host name as a string, either a host name or an IP address. If you send list, it will send back a JSON block with groups as keys and an array of hosts for each. I'll show an example of that in a moment. And our host just sends back a dictionary of variables associated with that particular host. Once those variables are specified, those variables become available as variables within the playbook when that host is being orchestrated. So let's look at output from a trivial --list. This might be an example. So I have two groups here. One of them is called all, and one of them is called foo. The all group has two servers in it, foo and bar. The foo group has just foo. Bar is not in another group. There is no group called bar, so I would not be able to reference such a group. If I have a playbook that's keyed to run against all, it will run against both of those two machines. If I have a playbook that's keyed to run against foo, it will run against just foo.example.com. If I have a keybook that's keyed to run against bar, it will error out. It will say that it doesn't have a match. When you send --host, what you're responsible for returning back is a direct dictionary of variables, key value pairs. JSON is nested, and that's fine. You can send back a JSON key with a dictionary as a value, or a list as a value, and that will be available to Ansible as such. Because Ansible uses Jinja for templating, Jinja has the ability to parse lists and dictionaries with no problem. But that makes this key, fancy info, available as a variable in the playbook. So if I do my brace break, curly brace, fancy info, d curly brace, within my playbook, I'm going to get the integer 1, 2, 3, 4. Types are preserved. It is worth noting that some variables have intrinsic meaning to Ansible. Setting them will do something. If you set fancy info to 1, 2, 3, 4, the only thing that's going to do is that's going to make that variable available within your playbooks. Most things that begin with Ansible underscore will do something. And if you choose to define one that we don't define yet, we've reserved all that for future things, so don't do that. So for instance, if you have a machine that's localhost, you might choose to define Ansible connection :local. What that would do, for those that aren't familiar with it, is instead of using SSH as a transport, it will just run operations on localhost and not worry about piping everything through the SSH key. One aspect of this that is worth noting is that Ansible will call the inventory plugin for every relevant host. If you have a playbook that runs against all, in my previous example, it will then call that inventory script with -- host for both foo.example.com and bar.example.com. It will have to run the inventory script. This can cause some overhead because, sure, it's not that bad to run the inventory script if you have 2 hosts. But if you have 1,000, then suddenly running this inventory script 1,000 times, while not being prohibitive, is expensive. And so, as of Ansible 1.2, so ages and ages and ages ago, actually it might be 1.3, still ages and ages ago, Ansible provides a way to send back the variables with the list call so that this becomes something that's done in one fell swoop and future host calls are not made. And that's with the _meta group variable. So let's go back and look at our list. I've gotten rid of the foo group because we don't care about that. But I've retained our all group that talks about foo.example.com and bar.example.com. I then have _meta, and within it I have a dictionary. And that dictionary has 2 keys. Those keys correspond to the host names provided as strings in these lists up here. And then each of those keys is a dictionary with key value pairs. And I meant to have 5, 6, 7, 8 as my second one. Oops. But the principle remains. So if I run, when I orchestrate foo.example.com, this will go back and it will send the key baz with the value of 1,234. When I do the exact same thing on bar, it will do the same thing. Those are independent of each other. Like I said, I meant to have this value be different. That's a mistake. And that's inventory plugins. Let's talk about lookup plugins. Lookup plugins are probably the second easiest and most common way to both extend the way an Ansible playbook runs and to optimize it so that you aren't repeating yourself unnecessarily, so that you can have your data coming from your infrastructure. This is very, very, very important. There should not be a need, if at all possible, to sync data from your tools that you built into Ansible's playbook runs. Ansible has the ability to go ask your tools what your data looks like and iterate over it accordingly. And that's what lookup plugins do. The purpose of a lookup plugin is to provide a way to get information that is only known at runtime into a playbook. It's only known at runtime because it's on your tool over here and it might change, or any number of other reasons, but that's the most common one I've seen. They're an alternative to providing variables precisely because they are computed as you go. Writing a lookup plugin involves defining a Python module with a lookup module class. And the only real rule about that lookup module class, it doesn't have to extend anything, although Ansible does provide a base class if you choose to use it. The only thing it has to do is it has to define a method spelled run. And that run method must take one positional argument, well, beyond self. That's 6 self, obviously. And then one additional positional argument called terms. And then it also has some keyword arguments. Inject is one, and you should end it in quotes just in case something gets added in the future, in a future version of Ansible. Not very likely, but it could happen. The terms are the things coming in from your playbook. I'll show an example in a moment, and that will make more sense. The Python module with the lookup module class will be a file in your file system, and your ansible.config file will point to your lookup modules directory with these files in them. The way that it's referenced in a playbook is you prepend with underscore to the name of the Python module to access the lookup plugin. We'll go into that in just a moment in an example. A quick aside, when writing lookup plugins, you're probably almost always going to want the ansible.utils.listify lookup plugin terms method. This will take the term that you provide to in your YAML playbook and make it into a list. And the reason why this matters is because, for readability reasons, it's going to be very likely that you might send it in as a string a lot of the time. It will take that string and make it a list. It'll also do things like comma separation and the like for you. So let's look at a very, very, very simple lookup plugin. We're going to call this lookup plugin alphanums.py, and we're going to assume, for purposes of argument, that it is in an appropriately configured location. So let's see what this class does. Well, we have class lookup module. Because I do most of my work in Python 3, I didn't think to explicitly extend object, but it doesn't matter. It has a run method, because remember, the only thing a lookup module has to be is it has to be a module with a member class named lookup module, and that class must provide a run method with self terms and keyword arguments. It's going to set up its answer list that it's ultimately going to return back. It's going to run the listify thing against its terms. So after this line here runs, we know that terms is a list. It might have been a string before. It could have potentially been a number before. It probably couldn't have been a dictionary. I'm pretty sure that would just fail here. But at this point, it's a list. And so now I can just use list membership to see whether particular things are in my list. If I sent a string, probably I'm going to have a list with one member. I don't care about that. So let's ask if my arbitrary string ABC is in my terms list. If it is, then I'm going to append to my answer list the values string A, string B, and string C. Similarly, if I got a string back that's 1, 2, 3, I'm going to append to my list the values int 1, int 2, and int 3. Now at this point, I will have a list with either 0, 3, or 6 elements. I don't care how many it is, I'm going to return it. Because this is a ridiculous lookup plugin with no error checking at all. Now let's see about how to use this. So this is a playbook that uses that lookup module. And the only thing that this task role does is it prints a debug message saying my value is item with alphanums A, B, and C. So what this is going to do is it's going to run 3 times. It's going to debug out my value is A, then it's going to debug out my value is B, then it's going to debug out my value is C, and then it will be done. If I had put DEF here, it would do nothing, because it would have returned back a list with 0 elements. And what happens when you iterate over an empty list? Nothing happens. Code doesn't run. If I had put 1, 2, 3 here, actually if I put it here as an int, it probably would have done nothing as well. If I put it here as a string, then I would have gotten back my value is 1, my value is 2, my value is 3. And if I were to make a YAML list here with A, B, C, and 1, 2, 3 as a string, I would get my value is A, my value is B, my value is C, my value is 1, my value is 2, and then my value is 3. Now, this is obviously a very trivial and relatively silly lookup plugin, but you should be able to get from this concept to see how this can be applied. Nothing stops this lookup plugin from asking another service about its values. Nothing stops a lookup plugin from doing grouping. If you have, for instance, a user management tool that knows about your company's employees, and they each have different access levels, you might have with users sudo for the ones that get sudo access on your box versus all of them, versus maybe people without sudo. It's not very hard to see how you can take this and have it ask whatever service you have in your infrastructure for information and return back that information to be used in your playbook tasks. And that's all I have to say about lookup plugins. Let's talk about the last one, which is callbacks. callbacks are a little bit unlike lookup plugins or variable plugins or inventory plugins or any other kinds of plugins because they are triggered as a response to events. If you have a lookup plugin that you never reference, if you have alphanums.py, you don't ever say with _ alphanums in your playbook, that lookup plugin will sit idle. It might even be able to have a syntax error and everything would be fine, although I wouldn't swear to that. But it won't do anything. Similarly, if you have an inventory plugin and you don't use it, and you don't say -i this file, or otherwise reference it in your Ansible config or whatnot, it won't do anything. Callbacks are different. Callbacks register themselves with the Ansible runner. So whatever is in your callbacks directory will be parsed, and if it has a callback module class with, obviously the various different methods that we'll talk about in a minute, it will register itself with your playbook. And then as certain things happen within your playbook run, these callbacks will fire. Callbacks are defined very similarly to lookup plugins. They have a Python file in an appropriate spot defined in your ansible.cfg. Within that, it must have a callback module class. And that callback module class must define a set of methods. That list of methods is actually somewhat long, but I'm going to go over a couple of them. A subset of those methods are things like onAny, playbook on start, playbook on stats, which is when the playbook completes, regardless of whether or not it failed, succeeded, maybe succeeded on some hosts and failed on others. Playbook on stats is at the end. Runner on OK for a task, runner on failed, or if a task fails, runner on unreachable. Unreachable is if it's unable to get into a box in the first place. Unreachableness in Ansible is a fatal error. There are several others, but quite frankly, they won't fit on a slide. There's about 12 more. If you want to get a full list, go into the Ansible codebase. It's very fast. They've got a link to 2 of the callback plugins in Ansible itself. One of them is to use OSXSay, which sounds incredibly obnoxious. And but it's got a full list. Callbacks fundamentally represent hooks for inserting functionality into different areas of a run and in response to different situations. Basically, they handle situations where just your plain handlers that you define in your playbooks are insufficient. They are a more complicated but more powerful way to do things in response to various hook points within a playbook run. And that's all I got. Went 3 minutes under. If anyone has any questions, I'll be glad to take them.
Really bad question, but you mentioned that this now supports Windows.
Ansible 1.7 supports Windows.
What does it use? I assume does it use SSH or does it use a different mechanism since
so Ansible transports are pluggable. You don't have to use SSH, but it is the most common. Like I gave an example of using local. As of 1.7, we switched the default from SSH to something called Smart. But I don't know enough about, or I had nothing to do with our Windows stuff, and I have no idea what transport it actually uses. I don't think it's SSH, but I wouldn't swear to it.
Does it require a client? I assume on Windows it requires a client?
I don't think so. I think, I'm speaking very off the cuff here, because I am very much a Linux person. The only thing I do with Windows is play Final Fantasy XIV. The only thing I believe that there is some kind of transport that's generally available in Windows that is what we use as long as you're running both the orchestrating machine and the client machine on Windows. I don't know what it is, but I think that's how key phrase here, I think that's how it works. If you're running with the orchestrator on Linux and the client on Windows, I'm pretty sure you have to install something. In fact, I'm positive you have to install something, but you install on the orchestrator. So basically, there's a Python module that name is completely and totally escaping me that is a dependency. And when you install it, you get Windows support. But it uses Windows. I'm 80% sure it uses Windows' magical transport of Windowsiness.
I can look it up. I just haven't.
It seems like I should probably know. I just don't. Any more questions?
One more. I assume that there would be no issue with it talking to, let's say, a Switch or ASA or some other.
Certainly not the Switch supports SSH and is running a supported OS, so Linux, Mac, Windows. If it's running Chrome OS, you have a problem. Yeah, maybe that would work. I don't know. If it's Palm Pilot, you're probably out of line. That was a joke. If it is needing some kind of other transport, if it's not running SSH or whatever the Windows magical thing of Windowsiness is, then you would need to either find or write a transport plugin, which is way beyond what I'm talking about here. But fundamentally, it could be put in as long as you could write. I expect it probably needs to be Python, as long as you can write a transport plugin that will work. Whether we ship it is a very different question.
How would you access a machine behind a VPC, and so you might have to SSH and then SSH again?
Sure. So the question is, how do you access a machine that's behind some kind of VPN or other mechanism where you have to make an extra hop? There's a couple different ways to do that. We, I believe, actually ship. I wouldn't swear it because I haven't done it, but I think we actually do ship out of the box a concept for doing that hop. So if you have like one server that's open to the world and then they can get to all the others, I think we can do that. Obviously, the most common way, and probably the recommended way, is to have your Ansible orchestrating machine be within that VPN, and then it just works. Like there's no, you don't have to talk to us to use Ansible. It's not like, say, Enterprise Chef, where they give you a Chef server and you upload your cookbooks to Opscode. We don't have that concept. As long as, if you have your Ansible playbooks in GitHub and you check them out of GitHub onto a machine inside your VPC, then now you're inside the VPC and you can just run it. If you were wanting to do something where, say, you could run it from your phone, which is relatively common, then you would either want to deal with that, getting into the VPC problem on your phone side, or you would need to do something like a jump through, which is, I understand that's also really common in databases. If you want your database server only to listen on localhost, it's really common to have your database client, your MySQL or pSQL client or whatever, shell into the box and then connect to the database on localhost. It's especially common in the MySQL world. And I don't know if we ship that or not, but transport did. Do you have a question?
I did, but I can't think what it is.
Then I can't tell you.
Yeah, if you already have a large number of resources that are under management by Puppet, what would be some of the use cases you might see for Ansible to use in that type of environment?
Sure. So the question was, if you already have a large number of a large amount of orchestration being done with another orchestrator, Puppet was this example, and so the first thing I would ask you is, what's your goal in asking that question? Is it that you would want to be migrating over time? Is it that, what would be the rationale for having two tools in play at the same time?
So far, like Ansible better than Puppet.
Okay, so migrating over time is the answer to that question. The obvious leg-in, and actually a leg-in that we did in my previous job, is using Ansible to install the orchestrator. So I don't remember what the Puppet client is called. I think Puppet Master is the server, if I recall correctly. I don't remember what the client is. You should call it Marionette or something. But one thing that we actually did, we used Chef at my previous job because we started in the DevOps world before Ansible came out. And the very first thing we did with Ansible was use it to install the Chef client on all of our machines, and then kick off the Chef run. Because that way, what we could do is we could have a centralized hub that called out to the machines, got the Chef client on them, and then kicked off the Chef run. That was the very, very first thing we did. And then what we started doing was we, usually at the beginning of the various steps, so if you think about like all your Puppet books, you might have maybe 8 different atomic steps. So getting all of your prerequisites set up, and then installing X, and then installing Y, and then installing Z, and then configuring X, Y, and Z, and then your cleanup, as an example. So the first thing that I would probably want to consider doing in a situation like that is first I would have the Puppet Master on, which is a really fun irony for me. And then the next thing I would do is I would say, okay, I'm going to take all this initiation stuff, and I'm going to migrate that over to an Ansible playbook. And I would just migrate it one piece at a time, starting with the top, going to the bottom. Because it makes a lot more sense in an introductory period to put Ansible at the beginning, because it makes so much sense to have it serve the purpose of getting the other orchestration agent on the box. And so then it's just a matter of, okay, so here's your line. You have Ansible getting Puppet on the box and then Puppet doing all the other stuff. And you just constantly move this line down until it's the bottom. That's how we did migration. Anything? Did I answer your question? I'm not sure I did. Okay.
What's the largest environment that you guys have supported?
What is the largest? I don't.
Node type, node number.
We have successfully with Tower actually, and Tower is usually the breaking point. You can run thousands of nodes. We don't have like central servers that we ship this out to. You're providing your own server. Obviously, the bigger server you provide, the more forks you can have, the more. Ansible has the ability to run against multiple servers concurrently. The more servers you're running against concurrently, the higher your network traffic, the higher your memory and such. It's very dependent on your setup. It is possible to do it at the level of a couple thousand, because we've seen it done. I had never done it personally, but my coworkers have said they have done it, and done it with non-trivial playbooks. I mean, not like, oh, we echoed out 1, 2, 3 on 2,000 boxes at once. That's not all that interesting. I've echoed out 1, 2, 3 on 20,000 boxes at once. That's boring. Yeah. But for something like actually going and installing something, the big key thing is that because Ansible is a push system rather than a pull system, it's pushing out the various actions to each box, and so your network throttle is a thing there, and making sure that gets through okay. But it's very dependent on your setup, and it's very dependent on things like you're going to get much better results if you're doing it over 10 dot than if you're doing it over roll.
Do you use Ansible to set up your own personal Linux?
Yes. I have, so I'm on Macs for development work, so I don't use it for that. All of my development, so I don't work on Ansible Core, I work on Ansible Tower, which is our GUI product on top of Ansible. I have playbooks for working on Tower, and I use that with Vagrant and VirtualBox for local development. So every morning I get in and I Vagrant up, and I destroy my machine from the previous day, make a new one, and do my work for the day. I run a few servers off to the side. I run a TeamSpeak server, and I have an Ansible playbook that I wrote that downloads TeamSpeak, compiles it from source, sets up a user, and starts a server, does all other things. And we'll update it if need be. I have a couple others. I have an Ansible playbook to set up my wife and my wedding site that is, for some reason, still running, even though we've been married for 3 years. And I have 2 or 3 others. Basically, the way that I do it is that whenever I decide that I'm going to go buy a new server for a new purpose, I always get everything installed on that box with Ansible playbooks. So that way, if I decide I want to migrate hosts, if I want to move things around, other than migrating my data, I can destroy the box, run the playbook, and have my new stuff. It's a big deal when things like, I prefer Ubuntu for my distro, and so every 2 years I send all of my boxes from like 12.04 to 14.04. And usually the Ubuntu differences aren't that bad, so it usually works.
Can you interoperate between Windows and Linux, for example? So for example, have the orchestrator be running on Windows and orchestrate Linux machines, or the other way around?
I think so, but I wouldn't swear to it. I think it's much more likely that you can do Linux Orchestrator Linux clients Windows. I'm reasonably sure that works because, like I was telling him, the way I remember when I was digging around looking for something else, it has to install a special Python module that makes Python use Windows as transport, which I don't know what it is because I don't know anything about Windows. I doubt the other direction works. I highly doubt that you can have a Windows orchestrator and a Linux client. So I'm reasonably sure that you can have a Linux orchestrator and a Windows client. I'm reasonably sure that you can have a Windows orchestrator and a Windows client, but I wouldn't swear to that either. And I'm reasonably sure that you cannot have a Windows orchestrator and a Linux client. But again, grain of salt.
Is Ansible Tower just a single server, or can you somehow orchestrate, have multiple towers handling the same?
Right now it is single server. So we have gotten some requests for what's called HA, which is if their tower server fails, they want to fail it over and are working on that. The idea of having multiple tower servers, like so say that you're orchestrating 3,000 servers at the same time. The idea of having 5 different towers that share the jobs to scale out that way is not something that currently does. I would love for it to do that. Like, as a person who works on the Ansible Tower product, I would love for it to do that. But it is not. Anyone else? Okay, that's all I got.
Okay, so Claire has asked to give a
That's
quick
my name.
announcement.
No, I don't. So I am Claire Vo. I am CEO and CTO of Experiment Engine. We are a startup here in town. We just went through Techstars. We are hiring our first technical hires into our team, and we are built on Python and Django. And so if anybody's interested in getting involved in our awesome startup, we do A/B testing, but we're backed by a marketplace of conversion rate experts. We make A/B testing easier for marketers and product managers. Come talk to me or my co-founder EJ back there in the green. We'd love to talk to you. So that's it. And I have a first name because I was thinking he asked me if I could come and make an announcement. If I had
Apparently that's all that's required. Yeah. So, okay, cool. One other quick announcement, just kind of as a meta thing, and you may notice, like I'm seeing a lot of new faces. A lot of older faces, but a lot of new faces, and a lot of the existing organizers. None of the existing organizers are here right now. Travis Weisskopf has left, has moved to LA. I don't know if anybody knew that. Yeah. So I think he's still with Continuum, but he's in LA now. And anyway, the point is, we're going to be looking for new organizers soon. So for those of you who've been around for a while and maybe want to help out some more, or people who are new to the community and want to, help make this a regular thing, and maybe not last minute like it was this month, then we'll be looking for help. So tweet at AWPUG or email like awpug-organizers@google or at gmail.com. We're always looking for new talent. And if you want to give a talk, please let us know. I'm always happy to take on new stuff. So any other announcements? Anybody have anything? Anybody want to do a lightning talk? No? Okay. All right. I think that's it for this month. Thanks, y'all.